Here. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Quednau, and welcome to our latest live episode of Strong Talk. Today, I'm going to be diving into a topic that I wrote about last week on our site, which quoted a lot from an article that Dan wrote, who I'll introduce in a minute. And it was about a population of cyclists that often goes unnoticed, low-income cyclists, immigrant cyclists, people who are not biking by choice, but because that's the only way they have to get around. So today we have three wonderful guests. Dan Koeppel, am I pronouncing your name right? He's the author of an article from Bicycling Magazine that I quoted in my piece a lot. He's an author and columnist. He's written a lot about bikes for a variety of different publications. We also have two Strong Towns members, Alex Baca, who runs the bikeshare program in Cleveland, Ohio, and John Simmerman, who is the founder of Active Towns, which explores and documents people and organizations that promote healthy and active living. So welcome, everybody, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rachel, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Dan, I'd like to start with you. Tell me about the article that you wrote. I know it's over 10 years old, and we just stumbled across it and thought it was worth sharing more about. But if you can think back to when you wrote that and like the impact of it and what was the inspiration behind writing that?
Yeah, it was actually a very interesting and relevant. I mean, the whole article I think is still relevant, which is good and bad. But I have a good friend named Aaron Salinger, who's a bike advocate here. He is also a teacher in the Los Angeles Unified School District. I believe he teaches first graders. He's bilingual and teaches bilingual classes, and he's also a bike guy. And one day he came to me and told me that he had asked his students to draw some pictures that showed how they might use bikes in their lives. And these were mostly Latino kids. And one of the kids, who had recently come from Mexico, drew a picture of his father riding a bike over a wall at the border, like jumping his bike over a border wall. This was 10 years ago. And Aaron and I started talking, and he said, why don't we go down to MacArthur Park? Because there's all these guys on bikes, and let's just talk to them, and maybe there'll be something that we could write about. And so it was pretty organic. And for me, someone who's been riding bikes in Los Angeles, a white guy who's been riding bikes in Los Angeles for my entire adult life, we call these mostly men invisible riders. And it didn't mean they were supposed to be invisible. It meant they were invisible to people like me and, by extension, the readers of Bicycling Magazine. And at that time, we were having such a hard time in LA with bike infrastructure. And it just seemed to me that, one, it was not, it was kind of like ridiculous in a moral sense to not acknowledge these people who are out there on bikes, but also like to not enlist them in bike advocacy, like in terms of both planning and facilities, was just, wrong and also strategically foolish. And that was the reason I wrote the article.
What were the responses and what was the impact after you published it?
Anytime, I mean, I've written about immigration a bit, and I'm not just with bikes. I mean, anytime you write about immigration, you get this sort of explosive bunch of reactions, ranging from, nice cat. That's great. The reaction was, it was mostly positive, ranging from that, but there was also a lot, they shouldn't be here. These guys are on stolen bikes. You're approving of illegal immigration. I mean, all this stuff that honestly, like, I thought was just a bunch of bull. I mean, to me, it was like, these are cyclists. Like even if you separate it from whatever the national politics are, these are cyclists who are getting injured and who are not getting the facilities and treatment they need, and they're working hard and they're on the bikes more than any recreational cyclist. And so it did, I think, help, along with a bunch of other things that were happening, get the LA advocacy community into a place where diversity was more important. I don't want to take anything close to credit for that, but that's something that was happening along with that story.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more broadly about the cycling community and how like low-income communities' needs intersect with that. Alex, I know as the bike share director for Cleveland, and I think you've written about this and talked a little bit about this at our recent event. You wrote a piece that and spoke with a piece that was called "Bike Share Won't Save Your City" and talked a bit about this. Like, bike share is not perhaps the best way to try to like meet everyone's cycling needs. Yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to sort of preface this by saying that I think bike share is great, right? Like, I run a bike share system. I think, anything that presents an option that's not driving can, it's better that it exists than it doesn't. And then maybe you can see some of those mode share gains. But a lot of cities, a lot of municipalities, I'm not trying to call out where I work specifically, but I think a lot of places, see bike share and say, oh, like, we want that. Wouldn't it be amazing to have this, like, basically, ideally self-funding, very green, very attractive, like sort of hip, press-worthy transit system in our city that like could totally like shift trips and provide last mile connections. You need so much bike share to shift the mode and to provide last mile connections. And, I run a 25 station system. We're only going to get up to 30 stations with our existing funding. That's not to say that some people aren't using it and, getting out of their cars, but that, in order to really make the gains that I think people generally want to see with bike share, there needs to be a lot more of it. And as soon as you start talking about equity and bike share, you hit a whole bunch of other issues. We're working on rolling out an equity program that I'm pretty pleased with. It combines like a banking option for unbanked populations with like free memberships, and it also includes some subsidized memberships. I'm really happy with the way this is shaken out. We have maybe like 3 stations in neighborhoods that like have like really high like lack of car ownership. So like, you can put together the equity program, but that doesn't mean necessarily that like your infrastructure is equitable. And, once you put it there, do you even want to ride a bike there? I mean, the neighborhoods that are considered the poorest, blackest neighborhoods in Cleveland, they are not bad neighborhoods, right? They're, they're just like my neighborhood. They have different levels of enforcement and infrastructure and attention, but they're not bad neighborhoods. But the city as a whole is not a really pleasant place to ride a bike, and it gets worse in those neighborhoods because of the historic disinvestment there. So, you do need to be talking about like, what assets are you giving to people? It's not enough to just set up, an accessible membership program. Like, you really need to put the infrastructure there. I think Next City had a really recent good piece about City Bike and how, to really expand their equity stuff. It wasn't cash payments, there was a degree of outreach, but what really made a difference was actually putting the stations where people in public housing complexes needed to go. So
yeah, I know when I look at the bike share map in my city, it's very clearly like in the wealthy middle class neighborhood section, and the poor neighborhoods have no bike share.
And that's probably because it needs to make money, right? Like,
yeah,
or it needs to be viewed in some way. So, you do have to consider like, is this public infrastructure? Are you truly going to publicly subsidize it and make it something that works for everybody? Or are you going to let, either a strapped nonprofit or a for-profit operator make those decisions?
Yeah, it seems like the same things happen too with bike lanes. My city doesn't really have great bike lanes anywhere, but the ones that do exist are definitely in the wealthier neighborhoods. Does any of you want to respond to that? Bike share, bike lanes, bike infrastructure in general, where it's located, where it's not located. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's ultimately when we think about our communities and how they're designed, they need to be equitable in the sense that, all ages, all abilities, all socioeconomic statuses need to be able to use our public spaces. The truth be told is that if there's a discrimination that's happening, it's really a discrimination against anybody not in an automobile. And when we look at the fact that, yes, there's certain areas of disinvestment that, historically has been out there, but, at the end of the day, especially when I read the old article, reread it actually, it really reminded me of how places that have a much more bike and ped oriented environment overall, how these individuals who by necessity are using this mode of transportation simply because it's the most logical for them to be able to use. It's cheap, it's affordable, they're able to access it. And they don't really see themselves as bicyclists. I mean, even us, calling them, invisible bike riders, they're just people. They're people that are choosing a logical next step of transportation for themselves, which then puts them in alignment with people who live in Copenhagen, people who live in Amsterdam, because they're just doing what's logical for them. It's a logical choice to be able to walk, bike, or take transit. The really main difference is those places, have a much more balanced approach so that there is choice in transportation options. What's great from my perspective as a health promotion person and somebody who wants to see the built environment encourage healthy physical activity is, even though these individuals don't view this as exercise per se, they're getting it in. And that's just coincidentally is exactly how, the people in these other countries that we hold up on high of, oh my gosh, these are great cycling cultures. They don't view it as that. They just view this as intelligent. It's pragmatic. It's utilitarian. So,
yeah.
We have a really interesting in progress case study going on here in Los Angeles where I live. I live in City Council District 1. In Los Angeles, the City Council, it's so gerrymandered that it's almost impossible for an incumbent to lose. A local bike advocate has brought the election to a runoff, which is happening on Tuesday. There's been a lot of nasty stuff and that isn't necessarily worth getting into here, but I think the fundamental debate and thing that's tough for a lot of people is the councilman, the incumbent, is very opposed to bike lanes, very car oriented, yet he has really good credibility with the Latino community, which he's part of. He was instrumental, for example, in getting undocumented people driver's licenses in Los Angeles. Which is a really important thing. It's a safety thing as well. When people have driver's licenses, they get insurance, they drive more carefully, there are fewer hit and runs. Our bike advocate who was running against him and who got to the runoff has been fighting for bike lanes here, and they have been blocked. We literally, in our district, bike lanes end at the border of our district, and our councilman has blocked them. And that's because of LA's bizarre political structure where city council people can rule. But the bike lanes have been successfully positioned as a symbol of gentrification and not a symbol of safety, of communication, of community, or anything like that. The narrative that bike lanes equal gentrification and bike share as well equals gentrification has been very strongly sold. But I don't want to say it's just something that's been for sale that people have bought, because the folks who have bought it actually feel that way. They do see the addition of bike infrastructure as a sign that they're going to possibly lose their homes and be forced to move, and that is a thing that has to be respected and paid a lot of attention to, because it's real. I'm for bike lanes, but I don't want to deny that the concerns people have feel real to them, if and not necessarily real to me. That's a big difference, and it's something we all have to be sensitive to.
Yeah, Alex, have you dealt with that stereotype that that bike share means gentrification?
Yeah, in Cleveland, not so much, not currently, but I'm from DC, and I actually wrote this story 6 years ago around, I think when we were seeing some mayoral candidates ramp up in DC, and things were just like a lot more heated there. So part of the point of writing that piece was that we could sort of see what was coming. So I worked for the Alt Weekly there at the time, and like we could sort of see that the discourse was going to push bike lanes towards like the bike lanes are white lanes thesis, which I have like my own issues with. And, you know, part of that story reflected that in sort of saying like, you know, people don't like bike lanes for a lot of different reasons. We had a lot of really wealthy white homeowners blocking it on, you know, the substance of like what we would call NIMBYism now, which was like not a term 6 years ago. But, you know, so you saw parts of that as well. You know, at the same time, it is important to like identify that people's feelings are valid. Like there's a reason that they feel that way. And largely, like I would say structurally, we've commodified safety, we've commodified walkability, we've commodified like streets that you want to like sit on your porch on. We've made those things for white people, like in terms of like the way that our cities are set up and the way that our political systems are set up and the ways that we put those things together, you know, in sort of like enabling a lot of sprawl and banking on private investment to revitalize our inner cities. Like we've basically turned a lot of the things that like make sense for a ton of people, regardless of your race or your income or your gender, into commodities that we can then sort of have these like, that become these signifiers that don't, you know, once you peel the layers back, that like logically it's not there. Like biking itself, you know, it is this really logical, very low cost way for lots and lots of people to get around if you're able-bodied. You know, however, the cultural significance that we've attached to it is just like way beyond that. And so I think you have to keep in mind that like we've made a lot of the things that we like about cities like as like these like proxies for white people and for wealth. And it doesn't have to be like that. I think you would need a really progressive mayor, you would need a really progressive council, you would need a lot of stuff to happen in order to move away from that. I think that's something that you guys work on at Strong Towns, that we're probably all working on. But it's really hard. And I have no doubt that like, you know, if my bike share system were to expand, like we would have a lot of like uncomfortable conversations around that. But they're conversations that you need to be having. And, you know, when I talk about this stuff, I do try to frame it as like, this makes your street safer. This makes it, you know, your kids can't ride these bikes, but, you know, when you have people like riding bike share, like your streets get safer and traffic slows down, and maybe we can do some landscaping around the station so we can get some trees in your street. Like we've turned street trees into a commodity. Like if you look at Cleveland's tree canopy, like it corresponds with the race of your neighborhood. So it's not just bike lanes, it's a bunch of like the nice stuff in neighborhoods that we've turned into these signifiers. So.
Yeah, Dan, you kind of talked about this in the article a bit, that the invisible nature of the bike riders isn't, you know, literally we don't see them, but it's that they aren't part of the bike conversations happening, you know, city council meetings or whatever. And I know part of that is probably because of immigration status and not wanting to like draw attention to yourself and things like that. But do any of you have thoughts on how we can better expand those forums for discussing these things and making community decisions?
I think, you know, I mean, I think like the Los Angeles County Bike Coalition hired Tamika Butler as a person of color as executive director, and specifically with the idea that there would be outreach to people who are not served by traditional bike advocacy. I think, you know, this is a transportation conversation, and the conversation about bikes in the United States has often been a recreation conversation. And those are two different things. I mean, you know, I always tell people I don't really care if more people ride bikes from a strategic point of view. I care if fewer people drive in cars. You know, if they want to walk or take the bus, I mean, that's great, especially in, you know, LA, which is, you know, Los Angeles County is the size of the state of Connecticut almost. It's not practical to bike to work for everybody. But, you know, my article came out, you know, I think it was 2006. It was the height of Lance Armstrong mania when the entire bike industry was literally giving the finger to commuters, you know, in favor of carbon fiber and racing and stuff that I love. I mean, you know, I wrote a book about the Tour de France. I love everything about bikes, but it just was completely crazy to me. And in the years before that, in the 90s, when I started writing about bikes, editor of a mountain bike magazine, which is the ultimate bikes as recreation, not transportation. You have to put your bike on the roof of a car to get somewhere. And I actually like stopped mountain biking if I couldn't ride to the trailhead, because it just, even though I love it, because it just didn't wash for me. And so we have moved so far in talking about transportation and not recreation, but nowhere near far enough. I don't think in Los Angeles or most of the United States. And so people see bikes still as a toy, the vast general public, fitness tool, which they are, but it's a different thing when you're talking about bikes as part of a transportation infrastructure.
Yeah, John, I bet you have thoughts on that. Like, how do you balance the bikes as recreation versus transportation, or any other, athletic thing for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing, for us to step back and realize is that we like to give names to people and define them, and we're doing this now as we say, well, this is an invisible rider or a bicyclist, and this is a
cyclists.
Cyclists, the concept of the extra words and the cumbersome nature of saying, a person on a bike, people who are riding, rehumanizing this whole concept. Even in our language, when we say, well, the car ran through the red light. Well, actually, no, the car didn't run through the red light, at least not yet. It's not currently, to the best of our knowledge, an autonomous vehicle. So I think it's important to bring human back into this behavior and understand that we're just people. We're all humans that are trying to get around and live our lives to the best of our ability, and hopefully also have the luxury of also being able to do so in a healthful way, and including being able to live a lifestyle of physical activity that also is healthier for us. The reality is that I think it is important to then, when we take a step back and we look at, okay, well, how have we defined our public spaces? And when we see that, through 80 to 100 years of design, primarily as the motor vehicle, the single occupancy motor vehicle, to be precise, as being the primary means of transportation and getting around, the unintended consequences of, we get a Los Angeles that sort of looks like Los Angeles. Now, the good news is that Los Angeles, just like many other cities around the country, are getting better. And LA is actually my hometown. I'm fourth generation Los Angelino, and can remember riding a mountain bike through the city streets, going up to reach the trails to get up behind the Hollywood sign. And I'll say, Joe Bray Ali who's running in Council District 1. I mean, it's been refreshing to see the conversations that are taking place in the Los Angeles area. And I will echo, having, traveling all over the country, filming this cultural shift towards an environment which is more conducive to healthy physical activity. The battles that we're seeing in Los Angeles are being waged, around the country. And I think it's important for us to look at one concept is that change is stressful. One of the reasons why fear is such a big part of this narrative that we're having, and I'm seeing this in not only in environments and neighborhoods which are stressed from a socioeconomic status perspective, and there's fear of gentrification. But I see the same types of fear and resistance to a trail, a pathway, a bike lane, the removal of parking in affluent neighborhoods too. And a big part of this is that we must recognize that change is stressful. Even positive change is stressful. And so the fear factor, sort of gets embedded in there, and people latch onto that. And that fear spreads. And the next thing you know, we advance from the world of NIMBYism to cave people, citizens against virtually everything. So it's tough. I mean, it's tough as we're trying to move through this process. And ultimately, it really does require, I think, that we try to connect with people at their level within their communities, and make sure that they have a voice in what's happening, because nobody wants to feel like something is being foisted upon them from upon high.
Yeah. Yeah, Alex, how do you address those things when you're running your bike share program, and how do you listen to the neighborhood?
Into the neighborhood stuff. Well, we're not in so many neighborhoods right now, and the ones that we are in are the more affluent ones, and that's because I have to run a profitable system. So I would love more public money so that we could put these stations in places that could really make a difference in somebody's commute. That said, I think this always needs to be framed again as like, this is transit. Like, it's like single occupancy vehicles versus like literally everything else. Like, I also don't care if you ride your own bike instead of riding bike share, or if you walk instead of using bike share, or if you take the train instead of using bike share, because you didn't drive. And like right now, like Cleveland has like just this like horrendous air quality. We have like really awful like infant mortality statistics, like tied to lead, tied to asthma, tied to like all of this really, really terrible stuff. And like, it's not like transit versus bikes versus walking. It's driving, and it's sprawl, and it's like our regional air quality issues versus like, what can we do to reduce some of that impact? And I think like, as soon as you start, like, I love neighborhood political drama, like maybe more than I could. But like, as soon as you let that go, like down the route of like, oh, this bike lane like doesn't reflect the character of our community, like you have like totally lost the battle. Like, because like, it's not the bike lane, and it's not like the character of your community is a really valuable argument, but it's like, if that's getting triggered to talk about like a bike lane, like, which is like maybe 5 feet of road, like you have, like, you're not talking about safe streets, you're not talking about health, you're not talking about access, you're not talking about equity. Like, again, you're talking about something that has like a whole bunch of cultural signifiers like built up behind it. And so like, it's so hard to reshape those conversations. But like, as you guys know, just like going to any public meeting, there's somebody there because they don't want the bike lane there. And like, I think planners and politicians like have this significant responsibility to like do their research and have a better sense of like what's going on in the world, like what's going on in other places. We get really parochial in Cleveland, and we have these fights over bike lanes. They're still having these fights over bike lanes in DC, but it's gotten better as like this has been able to have this discussion about multimodalism, about health, about safety. So I always try to frame it in those terms. People say to me all the time, like, oh, I don't ride bike share because I rode my own bike. And it's like, that's awesome. Great. Like, that's great. Like that's great. That's like, you're so far beyond like where I need to get most people. Like, that's awesome. So, there are real, like, racial implications. Like I said, like we have racialized and commodified bike lanes. You need to listen to people when they're talking about like how that makes you feel, or like how that makes them feel. But when ultimately what you're talking about is like, what do people want their street to look like? By not having a bike lane, do they want high-speed traffic? Do they not want pedestrian crossings? Do they want stoplights instead of red lights? Like, you can actually start talking about the real design choices on streets rather than talking about sort of like the social and cultural stuff. That has how I've tended to approach this stuff from an advocacy perspective when I was working in bike advocacy and doing a lot of work in some of these shifting neighborhoods in DC. But the larger advocacy conversation between equity and transportation is like probably another webcast. It's a really, really tough subject when you have advocates who come to this from recreational riding. And I've always ridden for transportation. And, I would say that, the invisible cyclist stuff is not so invisible to me because like those are the guys that I would see when I was going to like community meetings on my bike. And those are they're not so invisible to people because recreational cyclists tend to complain about them for riding on the sidewalk. So
Yeah.
people are definitely seeing them, but they may not like what they see, and therefore it doesn't fit into what they think about as a cycling culture. And we don't need to balkanize the cycling culture. Like, we need multimodal stuff. We need people to drive less. So
Well said. Anyone have any closing thoughts before we wrap up? Awesome. Oh, Dan, are you muted?
Sorry, unmute.
Yeah.
I want to say that, someone asked me the other day, like how much have things changed in Los Angeles? I mean, hugely. I mean, we have this city council election, and bike lanes are almost winning the day, and might have won the day, which would have been great. But there's still so many different questions about how we navigate cities. I'm sitting here in my home office. My company has an office 3 miles away. I've been there 2 times in the past year. Yet,
Wow.
We were told last week, we're all going to have to start working in the office lately because of teamwork. I said, well, are we going to have any mass transit subsidies? Other people are asking about parking. So I just think we have a long way to go, and we have to solve the question of sprawl and navigating it, really. We have to solve for what's on the ground, and then also solve for what we dream of in the future. And those are often 2 very different things, and that's where the difficulty is, I think. Yeah,
that's a very good point.
Yeah, and I'd probably just chime in to say that to Alex's point is that we've sort of anointed these individuals the invisible bike riders, but really these are just people who are out there, and it's sort of like, once we have I'll use a car analogy just because I think a lot of people and a lot of the listeners will be able to relate to this. If you happen to buy an orange Honda Element, the next thing you see orange Honda Elements everywhere. It sort of gets up to the level of your consciousness. And just like Alex, I see those people who are out there using the bikes, using the trikes, using the cargo bikes. They're walking, they're pushing their carts, they're doing these things. And part of the reason why I'm recognizing this is they've bubbled to the top of my consciousness. And so I'm looking for them. And oftentimes when I go back and look at the film that I've shot, I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't really see that person. But now that I see him in the film there, and it really sort of reinforces in your mind. And to Dan's point, is that they're out there a lot. Their exposure to our streets is much, much higher because they're commuting oftentimes longer distances. Sometimes they're out at odd times of the day and night. So yes, they kind of blend into the background, and it's easy to miss them. But hopefully now, with increased awareness and continuing this dialogue, thank you, Rachel, for doing this, hopefully they will sort of percolate up to our level of consciousness, and they won't be so invisible into the future.
Definitely. All right, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for participating in this conversation and for your work on active transportation and transportation options for everybody.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Strong Towns.
Bye.